Jeremy Scahill, the title of the book is Blackwater, so let's begin there. What is Blackwater? It sounds kind of sinister.
Yeah, well, actually, the name comes from the hometown of the company, the area where the company is based, in Moyac, North Carolina. It was built near the Great Dismal Swamp, and so a lot of people say, oh, it's an ominous-sounding name. It must have something to do with covert ops, but actually, it's just named for the dark waters of the swamp. Blackwater is a company that didn't even exist about a decade ago, and it's since risen to become one of the most powerful private actors in the global war on terror. The company provides security for the top U.S. officials in Iraq, including Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. They guard all the congressional delegations that go over to Iraq, including that of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. They protect U.S. regional occupation offices in Iraq. They're training forces in Afghanistan. They were even deployed in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And this company really grew out of the war contractor bonanza that happened after 9/11. The company has $750 million in State Department contracts alone. But 10 years ago, it was little more than a 7,000-acre plot on a swamp in North Carolina, and the visions of its very wealthy founder, he was an ex-Navy SEAL.
So it took off after 9/11, but how did it got started in the 90s, so how did it get started?
It was founded by a guy named Eric Prince, and he came from a very powerful conservative family in the state of Michigan. His dad used their company, Prince Manufacturing, as a cash-generating engine to support Republican causes, the Christian conservative movement in this country. And so the founder of Blackwater grew up in this household where he saw his dad run a very successful business and be very engaged politically with Republican causes, Christian conservative causes. He was actually an intern at George H.W. Bush's White House, but he complained that it wasn't conservative enough for him. His dad, for instance, gave the seed money to Gary Bauer to start the Family Research Council. They were major funders of James Dobson and his focus on the family network. And Eric Prince was believed to be one of the wealthiest people ever to join the U.S. Navy SEALs. And in the mid-1990s, his father passed away and his wife had cancer. And so he had to go back to Michigan to sort of deal with the personal crisis in his family. And being a SEAL was no longer an option. And so in 1996, Eric Prince got together with some other special ops guys, and they started what was envisioned as a training center for law enforcement and a sort of sportsman's paradise. But in the early company literature, it's interesting because they said that they wanted to anticipate accelerated government outsourcing. And so during the Clinton years, Blackwater won a number of contracts. After the Columbine shooting, for instance, in 1999, Blackwater built a mock high school on their compound in North Carolina, and they called it Are You Ready High? And they trained SWAT teams and local law enforcement to deal with violence in schools. When the USS Cole was bombed in 2000, Blackwater got a $35 million contract to train sailors in how to protect the force in open waters, as was the case in the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. But then when 9/11 hit, Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, was on Fox News, and he said to Bill O'Reilly, I was starting to get a little cynical about how seriously people took security and training. Now the phone is ringing off the hook. And so Blackwater received a phone call with those phones ringing off the hook from the CIA, which contracted it to go into Afghanistan in the early operations after 9/11 inside the country. That was a black contract, and that really kicked off Blackwater's profile as a private military company providing private soldiers to the government.
So who works for Blackwater?
It's an interesting mix of former Special Forces guys all the way down to general infantry guys who have left active duty service. Now they also have law enforcement, former state troopers. There are many tiers of Blackwater operators. But what Blackwater is known for in the private military community is dealing in elite Special Forces guys, so former Navy SEALs, Delta Force, Green Berets, Army Rangers, and they are engaged in very high-profile defense of U.S. officials who are very much hated, for instance, in Iraq, and they've been very successful at keeping these people alive.
Can you make a lot of money working for Blackwater?
Tremendous amount of money. You know, I was talking to a soldier at Fort Hood the other day, and he said, you know, I was getting paid $28,000 a year, but it's a little bit better now. They're paying me $40,000 to be over in Iraq. That's the monthly take of some of the best paid troops for Blackwater. Some of these guys are making $1,000 a day tax-free. And so you have a situation where literally monetary gain has become a primary motive for fighting in the war on terror.
Is it a drain on the U.S. military? Are they finding that soldiers are getting out to take this higher pay?
Oh, yeah. In fact, folks at the Special Operations Command are saying that they're in a real crisis right now because so many people are going over to the private sector. There's slang now on the ground in Baghdad that when you leave the official U.S. military and go over to the private contractors, they call it going Blackwater. And so I think a lot of soldiers are looking at these guys in two ways. In one, they look at them with a sense of awe. These guys run around in these sort of commando-type outfits, wraparound sunglasses. They have body armor. They have heavy weaponry. They operate with limited rules of engagement, if any. And so I think that there's a sort of, they're impressed by them. On the other hand, I think that it really drains the morale of the troops because they see these guys running around making in a week what they make in a couple months. And I think they say, well, why is my life worth less than theirs? Why is it that they're being paid so much money tax-free?
Heavy weaponry. They don't run around with the same weapons that the U.S. military has access to, do they?
No, well, I think in some cases Blackwater has more sophisticated weaponry. One of the stories that I tell in the book is of a Blackwater contractor who had been on Paul Bremer's detail in the early stages of the occupation. He got into a firefight on the side of a road with some Iraqis, and he shot them with a blended metal bullet. Now, these are munitions that are not allowed for use by active duty U.S. forces. He shot an Iraqi, he says, in the buttocks, and it exploded the left side of his stomach. And when the military heard about it, they actually wrote him and said that they were going to court-martial him until they found out that he was Blackwater and not an official part of the U.S. force in Iraq.
Well, that brings up the issue of whose laws are these contractors responsible to.
Right, that's a great question, and I think a lot of people find it disturbing to know that we have about 100,000 contractors in Iraq right now, according to the Department of Defense. The Government Accountability Office says about 48,000, there are about 48,000 employees of private military firms operating in Iraq. There are no effective laws that govern them. One of the last things Paul Bremer did before he left Iraq was to issue an edict known as Order 17, which immunized contractors from domestic prosecution in the country. These contractors also, until now, have not been subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, commonly known as the court-martial system. The law that theoretically governs contractors on the battlefield is the Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act of 2000, which basically said that contractors that are accompanying the armed forces or working for the armed forces shall be subjected to U.S. law. In other words, a prosecutor would go over to Iraq, investigate a crime or a violation. They would interview witnesses, interview victims, and then they would take that contractor into custody, bring them back to the United States, and prosecute them for that crime in a U.S. court. Out of the 100,000 contractors in Iraq, there's been one indictment, and that just happened recently, and it wasn't an armed contractor. And so there are no effective laws. Now, right now in Congress, the Democrats are trying to expand that Military Extraterritorial Jurisdiction Act to include all contractors in Iraq, not just those working for the Department of Defense, because the problem is this. Blackwater largely doesn't work for the Department of Defense in Iraq. It works for the State Department. And so the current laws on the books would provide for Blackwater to essentially be above the law. There's no effective law governing their presence in Iraq.
Well, you say there are 48,000
Yes.
armed?
No, not all of them are armed. There are 48,000 employees of private military firms. Of those, about, let's say, half are actually engaged in some sort of armed activity.
Now, all those don't work for Blackwater.
No, Blackwater is not, I call them the most powerful mercenary army. They're not the biggest, they're not the most profitable. You have massive companies, publicly traded companies, DynCorp, Triple Canopy, that are bigger than Blackwater. Blackwater is just the closest to the throne in the United States. And so they have 2,300 men deployed in 9 countries around the world, and they have another 20,000 contractors at the ready for deployment at a moment's notice.
Closest to the throne, what do you mean?
Well, the leadership of Blackwater is an interesting mix of political bankrollers of the president. The founder of Blackwater and his immediate family have given about $250,000 in publicly identifiable funds to federal campaigns for Republican causes. The vice chairman of the company is a very well-known spy. His name is J. Cofer Black, former head of counterterrorism at the CIA, former ambassador at large on counterterrorism. He's a major power player, the man who caught Carlos the Jackal, and the guy who told President Bush, "I'll bring you Osama bin Laden's head in a box with dry ice." They have Joseph Schmitz, the former Pentagon Inspector General, whose job it was to oversee this war contractor bonanza, who then leaves office in 2005 under fire, of all people, from Chuck Grassley, the Iowa Republican, saying that he'd covered up investigations, he hadn't done his job. There was an indication from Grassley that he'd actually sort of intervened in the writing of a Justice Department press release. And so Blackwater is peppered with a number of former senior officials and political allies of the president.
So it's well connected, but what kind of reputation does it have in the business? Is it a top of the line, or is this a fly-by-night operation?
Oh no, the Blackwater is extraordinary in its forward thinking. I mean, these guys are at the cutting edge of fourth-generation warfare. They've at every turn proven themselves to be visionaries in predicting trends in global warfare, and I think for that reason they're very respected in the federal bureaucracy. I think among the military it gets a little bit more complicated. I think on the one hand, Blackwater is viewed as an elite force. They're dealing with guys who were the cream of the crop of the U.S. military, former Navy SEALs, and I think it trickles down to the soldiers as well as the generals. I think that there's two ways of looking at them. On the one hand, they're very good at what they do. On the other hand, they are sort of rogue operators, and I think there have been numerous occasions where U.S. military officials have gotten into conflicts with Blackwater and other contractors on the road. These guys drive around, they'll shoot at Iraqi vehicles. In fact, one of the senior U.S. military people on the ground in Iraq, whose job it was to oversee the reformation of the Iraqi security forces, himself had been in Iraqi vehicles that had been shot at by Blackwater contractors. So I think it's a complicated dynamic on the ground, but Blackwater also has proven remarkably adept at greasing the wheels behind the scenes. Once they became a vendor to the federal government, the game becomes who you know behind the scenes and how well you wax the system.
So if I'm say a brigade commander for the U.S. Army in Iraq, and I'm responsible for a certain sector of, let's say, Baghdad, and Blackwater is also operating in that sector, do I, as the brigade commander, have control over what Blackwater does?
That's a great question, and one of the internal reports that was done in December of 2006 by the GAO looked at issues with contractors, and one of the main crises that was identified by that report was this issue of command and control. Who ultimately is in charge? Now, the military would say we're engaged in an overt military operation, and the general should be in charge of what's happening on the ground. Blackwater, though, is working for the State Department. Their one job is to keep Zalmay Khalilzad alive, and they're going to do it by any means necessary. And that creates a real conflict of interest between the active duty forces on the ground and the private forces from Blackwater.
You used a phrase I hadn't heard before, fourth-generation warfare. What do you mean?
Well, one of the things that we've seen happen since the Bush administration came to power was that Donald Rumsfeld implemented this small footprint approach. The idea was to accelerate the use of the private sector, but also to engage in high-end technology and smaller private forces. And so Blackwater, for instance, is marketing unmanned spy drone. They're marketing surveillance blimps that could be used domestically in the U.S. as well as abroad. And I think at the heart of fourth-generation warfare is looking at how to use the most advanced parts of war technology to limit casualties on the ground, but also to advance military technology. And Blackwater has been at the cutting edge of that.
We hear over and over that the United States has the most powerful military in the world in recorded history. So why does the most powerful military in history have to hire another firm, a military contractor, to do what soldiers do?
Right. I think that's a question that a lot of people in the military are asking right now. I think that the Bush administration enjoys using these private forces because they provide a great deal of political cover. The deaths of Blackwater contractors are not counted in the official death toll. Some 780 contractors have been killed in Iraq. I actually think the number is higher. But we know that because the contractors use something called the Defense Base Act to provide insurance to their employees and their contractors. And so the Department of Labor has determined that 780 have been killed in Iraq, 7,600 have been wounded. But more importantly, their vast numbers don't get counted in the total occupation force. So if we have 130,000 active duty U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq, and then we have 100,000 contractors, most Americans don't know that. And so that effectively doubles the occupation force through the use of the private sector. Also, these forces, their crimes go unreported, undocumented. unpunished. And I think that it provides a lot of political cover to the Bush administration. It also, in this era of great secrecy that we live in, further shrouds the operations in secrecy. The operations of a company like Blackwater, Congress has found it almost impossible to determine what it looks like in Iraq. Blackwater has repeatedly refused to hand over documents to Congress. Blackwater's operations are not subjected to Freedom of Information Act requests. You know, we know that the military has court-martialed soldiers for violations in Iraq. And at the same time, these 100,000 private forces in Iraq are subjected not to the UCMJ and not to any effective civilian law.
How about for yourself? How hard was it to find out information about Blackwater?
Extraordinarily difficult. I filed many Freedom of Information Act requests, and I tried to build as complete of a picture as I could as to how much of the federal budget pie Blackwater was eating. The company's executives refused to go on record with me. I did talk to myself and my researcher, former executives at Blackwater, former guys who had served with Blackwater, the families of men who had served with Blackwater, and tried to present as full of a picture as I could. I also relied heavily for the official story from Blackwater on the excellent reporting of local reporters in Virginia and North Carolina in Blackwater's backyard.
Did you interview Eric Prince?
I had one interaction with Eric Prince where I tried to talk to him. I ran into him at a conference at the American Enterprise Institute, and I tried to question him, and he literally ran away from me. He jumped over a row of chairs, and I was sort of chasing him around a room with a microphone trying to get him to answer questions, but he didn't say one word to me.
What you're describing is basically outsourcing. And outsourcing is one of the hallmarks of globalization. So is it just globalization coming to the military, or is there something else driving this?
No, I don't think it's just globalization coming to the military. I think, in many ways, I think Blackwater embodies the very scenario that President Eisenhower warned against when he talked about the rise of the military-industrial complex, where you have companies whose entire livelihood depends on violent conflict. And I think that is one of the scariest developments. You know, I think we think of the military in this country as being defensive in nature, and I think that's why so many people join the military, is they believe that they're defending their country. But a company like Blackwater has a sort of neo-patriotic recipe that they feed to their men, where on the one hand they say, well, you're defending your country, and on the other hand they say, and you're going to get paid very well for doing it. And so what it does is it really takes the sincerity out of the equation of defending your country. And I see it as a real subversion of democratic processes in this country because, and this answers directly your question, the Bush administration is waging this offensive war in Iraq. And in order to do it, it needs private forces because so many Americans are against it. The military is in a real crisis right now. Colin Powell declared that the active duty military is about broken. And so where do you turn? Well, when you don't have the support of your country through the swelling of the ranks of the active duty military, you turn to the private sector. Blackwater, for instance, as much as they want to portray themselves as an all-American pie operation, has recruited mercenaries from Chile, from Colombia, from Bulgaria, from Fiji, from around the world. So you fail to build a coalition of willing nations, you build a coalition of billing companies. I tell one story in the book about Chile. This was a country 92% of the population was against the Iraq War. Chile was a rotating member of the Security Council opposing the invasion of Iraq. And Blackwater and other companies went in and hired 750 Chilean mercenaries in contravention of the will of Chile and its government and sent them to Iraq. That's a subversion not just of the American democratic process, but of nation states around the world.
So you call this a coalition of the billing?
Well, actually, P.W. Singer, who's the great scholar on this issue and wrote the definitive book, Corporate Warriors, on contractors, and the contractor system calls them the coalition of the billing, and I think a lot of us have picked up on that and enjoy that phrase.
Now, when Eisenhower was talking about the military-industrial complex, he was talking about the firms which build equipment for the U.S. military. So, and if you look at it that way, outsourcing is as old as the military. So what's the difference between hiring Blackwater to be a security consultant for you and hiring Boeing or Lockheed Martin to build an airplane for you?
Right. I think that the idea with using the private sector to provide hardware for the military or weapons systems is that you have competition in the marketplace, and so you're going to get the best product available. That's the theory behind it. When you now are sort of dealing in human life, which Blackwater and other companies do, you're putting private actors onto a battlefield. It'd be one thing if there were effective laws governing them and the U.S. military was in a crisis and we were engaged in a defensive war. Well, that's not true at all. We're not engaged in a defensive war. And so the real problem with this explosion now of the military-industrial complex is that they have crossed the line from simply manufacturing bombs and aircraft and guns to actually providing soldiers who are totally unaccountable. And that I think gets to the very spirit of why Eisenhower was making those warnings, that you have a situation where a politically connected company gets very lucrative contracts to provide forces whose operations are shrouded in secrecy. It's at its very essence, it's anti-democratic.
Some people will say that it makes no sense to train a soldier, teach him how to read a map, jump out of an airplane, all the things soldiers do, and then put them to work mowing lawns at the base. Isn't that what's going on here? You've got soldiers who are trained to operate as a unit, communicate, all the things that go into an organized military operation. Why have them standing around doing security for Jerry Bremer or the U.S. ambassador?
Right. That's one of the arguments that the private sector makes in supporting this cause. I think, though, that we need to look specifically at Iraq because this is where it's really exploded. The fact is that there are no longer enough active duty forces to sustain the occupation, and so they've accelerated the use of the private sector. And the problem lies where Blackwater is now doing a job in guarding the senior U.S. diplomats in Iraq that traditionally was done by the Diplomatic Security Corps. That's been dramatically outsourced. And you're creating a tier system where you're saying our active duty forces aren't as important monetarily as these private forces. And I think you create a real crisis of morale within the military when you have the private sector paid, in some cases, exponentially more than your active duty forces. And again, I think we have to put as our priority the democratic process in this country. And the fact is that when you have forces that are not accountable, whose operations Congress can't even get a hold of, that's a real problem. And so it's not just a simple matter of crunching numbers and whether or not the active duty military should do a job. Privatization is the real issue, and the dangers that comes with that of such a radical privatization. The danger is that there's no oversight, and I think that's what Congress is starting to realize is at play.
I remember the first time I sort of tumbled to the importance of these military contractors in the conduct of military operations was in Bosnia. And I went to the base, the main base at Tuzla, and all of the food services were contracted out, and the base, in fact, I think had been built by a contractor. But where did they, that's basically providing logistical services. And there's an old saying that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. Have you been able to identify a crossover line where these contractors became integral to U.S. military operations?
Yes. Well, in part. First of all, this all really started in its current form when Dick Cheney was Defense Secretary under George H.W. Bush. And one of the last things he did, you probably recall, David, before leaving office, was to commission a study from a division of Halliburton, the company he would go on to head. And that study looked at how to greater privatize the military bureaucracy. But it was the servicing of the military, as you mentioned, the laundry, the food services, anything that wasn't combat in its orientation. In the mid-1990s, there was one contract that the Clinton administration authorized that sort of changed the equation a bit. Clinton allowed a private military firm called MPRI, Military Professional Resources Incorporated, based in Virginia, to go into Croatia during the Yugoslav Civil War and to train the Croatian military. The Croatian military turned around and carried out a blitzkrieg called Operation Storm and Lightning, in which they expelled about 250,000 Serbs from the Krajina. The New York Times called that the single greatest ethnic cleansing of the war. But what it did is it turned the Yugoslav Civil War in favor of the U.S. position. And it happened by putting a few boots on the ground, a couple of retired military guys who talked strategy with the Croatian military, and they were able to effect change in a very radical way on behalf of the U.S. goals in the region. And that is viewed, I think, in the industry and among the scholars who've studied this as a real turning point. They actually were on the ground engaging with a foreign military that was an ally of the United States, and it was a successful operation from the viewpoint of the Clinton administration.
Now, when Dick Cheney was defense secretary. That was, of course, when the Cold War ended. And the biggest issue he dealt with was what was called the downsizing of the U.S. military, scaling it back now that you no longer had to compete against the Soviet military. And the size of the Army was basically cut in half. So isn't this a logical extension, his commissioning these studies? Isn't that a logical extension of the end of the Cold War?
Oh, I think that that's very much what Cheney and Rumsfeld certainly envisioned. I mean, I think that their global view when it comes to the running of the war machine is to run it more like a venture capital firm than a bureaucracy. In fact, you may recall in September of 2001, on September 10th, 2001, Rumsfeld gave this major address in which he said that governments can't die, and so we need to find other incentives to keep competition alive. And I think that they're very militant disciples of the free market system, and they believe in the private sector's role in government, period, not just in the military.
It happened, I think, too late to get into your book, but when David Petraeus was going through his confirmation hearings, he was to be the new commander in Iraq. He was asked if he had enough troops, and with this surge and the Iraqi forces that are being added to Baghdad, he figured he was going to have 85,000 troops when traditional counterinsurgency doctrine told him he needed 120,000 just for Baghdad. And his answer to this gap was, well, there are tens of thousands of contractors doing jobs that we don't have to do, which I think does make the point of how integral they have become in these operations. But what would happen if, pick your contractor, Halliburton, Blackwater, whoever, decided it was simply too dangerous to operate there anymore? Could we say, hey, you have to stay, we need you?
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if that happened. No, the U.S. Military nor the administration could order a company to stay in the war zone, and that's one of the things on the ground that differentiates a soldier from a private soldier. If a soldier abandons his post, he's going to be court-martialed. If a private soldier says, forget this, I'm off the battlefield, he just leaves. And but it's too profitable. There's no way that these companies are going to pull out of Iraq. The only way they would pull out of Iraq is if Congress legislated it. Bush is not going to pull them out. In fact, the Democrats in their legislation could have 40,000 troops in Iraq at the end of 2008 and an unlimited number of contractors. This isn't even on the agenda. And Rumsfeld in February of 2006 in the Pentagon's Quadrennial Review for the first time identified contractors as an official part of the U.S. total force. This was a legitimacy they couldn't have dreamed of before.
We're going to go to a break.
Afterwards and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Jeremy Scahill and David Martin in a moment.
Author and journalist Alexander Cockburn, live on In Depth, Sunday beginning at noon Eastern. In addition to his column for The Nation and being co-editor for the political newsletter Counterpunch, Mr. Cockburn has written over a dozen books, such as Corruptions of Empire, The Politics of Anti-Semitism, and A Dime's Worth of Difference. His latest, End Times, The Death of the Fourth Estate, discusses that news reporting is infiltrated with government and corporate agendas. Join our live 3-hour discussion as Book TV's In Depth welcomes Alexander Cockburn, Sunday at noon Eastern on C-SPAN 2. And in May, our in-depth guest is author and University of Texas professor Marvin Olasky. For a complete listing of Book TV programs and times, go online to booktv.org.
Afterwards, with Jeremy Scahill and David Martin, continues.
Just going to the little bio of you on the cover here of the book. Jeremy Scahill is a Polk Award-winning investigative journalist. What is the Polk Award, and what did you win it for?
I won the Polk Award. It's one of the more prestigious awards for in journalism. It's given by Long Island University, and I won that award for a documentary I did with my colleague Amy Goodman about the Chevron Oil Corporation's operations in the oil-rich Niger Delta of Nigeria. We went over there in the summer of 1998, and we documented an incident in which the Chevron Corporation had provided its own company helicopters to one of the most notorious units of the Nigerian security forces to go in and suppress a protest on one of the company's barges, and some people were killed and injured in it. And so we did an hour-long documentary about Chevron that ended up winning the Polk Award for foreign radio reporting.
You're also a frequent contributor to The Nation magazine. I think most people have heard of The Nation, but just give us a brief description.
The Nation magazine is the oldest political news weekly in the United States, and it's a mixture of opinion and investigative reporting. So my particular role at The Nation magazine has been to investigate private military companies like Blackwater. The editor is Katrina vanden Heuvel. Before that, it was Victor Navasky, both of them very well-known progressive thinkers and writers.
And it says you're now a writing fellow at the Nation Institute. I assume that's associated with The Nation magazine?
Yes.
And it's published by Nation Books.
Yes.
So I think I have the connection.
I'm a one-beat guy, I guess.
I think for most people, if they've heard of Blackwater before, they heard about it because of what happened in Fallujah in 2004. So explain to me what happened in Fallujah.
In many ways, it was the day the war turned. It was March 31st, 2004, 9:30 in the morning. A convoy led by Blackwater made its way into the center of the city. At the front of the convoy was a Pyro Jeep with a reinforced bumper, not an armored vehicle. Sitting in that Jeep were 2 Blackwater contractors. Behind that, there were 3 empty flatbed trucks being driven by Iraqi drivers. And then taking up the rear was another Pyro Jeep with 2 other Blackwater contractors. And their mission that day was to go to one end of Fallujah, pick up some kitchen equipment, and bring it back to the other end of Fallujah. At 9:30, they roll into the center of the city. They hit some sort of a roadblock. And within moments, the rear vehicle, the rear Pyro Jeep, is attacked by Iraqi insurgents. They shoot up the vehicle. They begin to tear apart the men inside. The lead vehicle turns around to either get off the X, meaning to get off the scene, or to turn around and help their comrades. And they too are overtaken by insurgents. And within moments, the original attackers disappear into the side streets of Fallujah, and a mob descends on the convoy, and they literally tear the men apart. They burn the men, they loot their bodies and take their possessions, and hundreds of people are dancing in the streets. They tie some of them to the back of a car, drive them through the streets of Fallujah, and eventually 2 of their bodies, charred, lifeless bodies, were hung from a bridge over the Euphrates River. One young man in the crowd held up a homemade sign that said, "Fallujah is the graveyard of the Americans." And for many people, it was the first that they'd ever heard of contractors operating in Iraq, not to mention private military contractors. In fact, some of the headlines that day say 4 American civilians mutilated in Iraq. But they weren't civilians, nor were they active duty military. They were private military contractors for Blackwater. And what happened after that was the siege of Fallujah. The U.S. military surrounded the city. I actually think that the Marines didn't want to take the kind of approach that ended up happening as a result of the Blackwater ambush. The Bush administration ordered a massive attack on the city, and that was the first of several sieges of Fallujah. They carried out 37,000 airstrikes, destroyed 19,000 buildings. Hundreds of people were killed. Scores of U.S. soldiers were killed in the various sieges of Fallujah as well. But what it did, David, is it inflamed the Iraqi resistance because at that time you already had Muqtada al-Sadr's Shiite forces rising up against the U.S. in Iraq. You had the Sunnis beginning to increasingly engage in resistance, and Paul Bremer had fired about 250,000 Iraqi soldiers as part of his de-Baathification program. So you had a real, you had a real volatile situation. The Fallujah ambush happens, the U.S. lays siege to the city, and all of a sudden you have an outbreak of very overt violent resistance in Iraq.
You say they were going through Fallujah to pick up kitchen equipment?
Right. Blackwater was operating on a contract with the world's largest catering services company. It's a company called ESS. And who ESS was ultimately contracted to, whether it was KBR or Fluor, would become the subject of a multi-year investigation by Representative Henry Waxman. So these men literally died for pots and pans. And their families all thought they were going over to Iraq to protect Paul Bremer. That's what Blackwater was doing at the time in Iraq. And so when it turned out that they, in fact, were dying for kitchen equipment, these families started to ask some very serious questions about what their loved ones were doing over there.
My first question would be, what was anybody doing in Fallujah in an unarmored vehicle?
Right, the U.S. military certainly wouldn't have gone into Fallujah in two Pajero Jeeps with reinforced bumpers. And so one of the things that's happened is that the families of those four guys have sued Blackwater. And what's come out of their lawsuit is some very interesting facts about that mission that day. According to the contract they operated under, they were supposed to have armored vehicles. They were supposed to have 3 men to a vehicle, a driver, a navigator, and a rear gunner who would be armed with a heavy saw machine gun. They only had 2 guys to the vehicle, meaning they had no rear gunner. They should have been in the armored vehicles. They say that they weren't provided maps of the area, that they weren't given a chance to do a pre-trip risk assessment. And what the families of those 4 guys allege is that Blackwater sent them in a haphazard way on that mission to cut corners and save $1.5 million. And they say that Blackwater was trying to impress this company, ESS. They had just won the contract from a competing private military firm. And so, you have the situation where these guys are like sitting ducks in the center of Fallujah. I think the Iraqis that attacked them believed that they were either CIA or Mossad.
Where does that lawsuit stand?
It was filed in January of 2005 in state court in North Carolina, where Blackwater is headquartered. And Blackwater has enlisted some very powerful lawyers. The original lawyer for Blackwater on the case was none other than Fred Fielding, who's now the White House counsel defending Bush. Their current lawyer of record is Kenneth Starr, the man who led the impeachment charge against President Clinton. And Blackwater has never disputed or even taken on the specific allegations of the lawsuit. It's a wrongful death lawsuit. Rather, Blackwater has tried to have the case dismissed. And the argument Blackwater puts forward is we're part of the U.S. total force. Rumsfeld said it, February of 2006. So we should be entitled to the same immunity from civilian litigation as the U.S. military is. And Blackwater twice has appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which I should point out is dominated by Republican appointees, and the Chief Justice is an appointee of the current president, and yet the Supreme Court rejected Blackwater's appeals. So it appears now as though this case is going to go forward in state court in North Carolina, where I understand there would be no cap on potential damages. And the lawyers for those 4 families are comparing it to the tobacco litigation of the 1990s, saying that once the first domino falls, it could cause shockwaves to ride through the industry. In fact, KBR has filed an amicus brief in the case, which gives you a sense of how important it is to that industry.
Have they specified the amount of damages they're seeking?
Not yet.
Now, the Marines were just outside Fallujah.
Right.
Did the Marines come to the aid of these Blackwater guys that were caught in that ambush?
No. The Marines, and I tell this story in the book, I think the Marines made a determination that that it was already done. The guys were dead and hanging from the bridge. And if they had gone in some kind of a heavy-handed manner, I think that they felt that they would have been subjecting U.S. soldiers to unnecessary severe danger. And I think that the Marines made a calculation that they had to let the scene play out. And so it wasn't an immediate response. And the Marines and also the 82nd Airborne both had been trying various approaches to dealing with Fallujah. And I think that they were trying to take what they call the hearts and minds approach to the city rather than what ended up happening, which was a crushing of the city.
If that had been a Marine unit that had been ambushed, I can almost guarantee you the Marines would have gone in.
And it's interesting because I believe the previous morning Marines had been ambushed and killed, and the Marines did come in outside of the city to do a recovery operation. So yes, I mean, I think it's interesting. There also is a story that these guys were out in the desert on the night of March 30th, these Blackwater guys, the day before the ambush, and they got lost, and they actually made contact with a military base. And I quote one source in the book as saying that when they arrived at the military base, they wouldn't tell any of the commanders what their mission was. And one of the commanders on the base said that they were like cowboys. So there could have been a lot of resentment toward them. I don't know if that personally isn't why they went in. I think they didn't go in because of what the commander said, that it would have just subjected Marines to unnecessary violence when the damage had already been done.
What did the Blackwater people know about conditions in Fallujah before they tried to drive through?
I think everyone in Iraq knew that Fallujah was a no-go zone and was a dangerous place. It had been the scene of intense fighting already between U.S. forces and Iraqis. There had also been some serious crackdowns inside the city on Iraqi demonstrations. In fact, the contract that governed their mission specifically named Fallujah as a dangerous area of the country, and talked about the threat of Fallujah. What these individual men knew about Fallujah, I don't know. I would imagine that they had the kind of knowledge that everyone on the ground had, that Fallujah is a pretty dangerous place. Although at least one of those guys on that mission hadn't even been in Iraq more than a few days before he found himself in the middle of what some people would say was the most dangerous city in the world.
Do these contractors have access to U.S. intelligence?
At some level. I mean, the individual guys on the ground don't. But there is a privatized green zone within the green zone where there's some limited coordination of the private military companies amongst each other. And so they share information and they have daily updates on what's going on in various parts of the country. But I think that there's a lot of tension between the official U.S. military and the contractors. There's also indications that the contractors maybe even have better intelligence in some cases and are not bound by the same kinds of chain of command issues. After a Blackwater helicopter was brought down in January in Iraq, one of the pilots, his brother had been killed in that operation. He also was a Blackwater pilot. Wrote an article in which he said that when people are really in trouble in Iraq, they don't call the U.S. military, they call Blackwater because we can respond faster.
You mentioned the downing of that Blackwater helicopter. Are there other incidents in which Blackwater personnel have been engaged in direct military combat?
Right. There have been at least 3 or 4 ambushes on Blackwater convoys. And then I tell one story which I find particularly disturbing. It happened on April 4th, 2004, just 5 days after the Fallujah ambush. So remember, the Blackwater guys are at the center of an increasingly outraged Sunni resistance in Fallujah after the killing of 4 of its men. And at the same time, Paul Bremer was really intent on this handover of sovereignty happening on June 30th of 2004. He wanted to hand over sovereignty and get out of Iraq. And so the Bremer and the administration, the Bush administration, made a determination. We have to crush the Sunni resistance, but we also have to deal with Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of the perhaps the most powerful Shiite resistance groups, the Mahdi army. And as the Fallujah incident was happening, Bremer orders the arrest of one of Muqtada al-Sadr's top deputies. And they believe that he was being held in Najaf. So al-Sadr's followers march on Najaf, hundreds and hundreds of them, and they descend on the U.S. occupation office in Najaf, the Coalition Provisional Authority building, and lo and behold, it's being guarded by Blackwater. So on this morning of April 4th, 2004, this massive demonstration takes place. There's about a half a dozen Blackwater troops on the roof of the CPA building, and by chance there were a handful of Salvadoran soldiers who were part of the Coalition of the Willing, and active duty U.S. Marine, a guy named Corporal Lonnie Young. So this guy, Corporal Lonnie Young, finds himself on the roof with Blackwater guys and Salvadoran troops, and they're looking down into the crowd. There are varying stories as to how the shooting happened, but it did it did happen. The Blackwater guys would say that they were fired on from the crowd. Journalists on the scene say that concussion grenades had been fired from the roof where the Blackwater guys were, and that started the fighting. In any case, a gun battle begins. Lonnie Young, this Marine, has his heavy machine gun pointed into the crowd. He says, and I got the official Marine account from Lonnie Young's testimony. He says he has a guy in his sight with an AK-47. He wants to open fire on him, but there's no commanding officer on the scene. And so he says to the Blackwater mercenaries, "Sir, I've acquired a target. With your permission, I want to open fire." And the Blackwater guy gives the go-ahead to an active duty U.S. Marine to open fire on an Iraqi protester, armed, he says. And so that day, it was Blackwater that was in charge of Salvadoran soldiers. It was Blackwater that was in charge of an active duty U.S. Marine. That, to me, embodies the serious lines that have been crossed. In fact, at one point during that operation, Blackwater called for reinforcements from Paul Bremer's Blackwater security detail, and they sent their Little Bird helicopters to bring in reinforcements to the rooftop in Najaf for this day-long firefight.
I guess you can argue whether it's a good or a bad thing to have these contractors, but or maybe it's just a necessary thing. But it definitely is a phenomenon of 21st century warfare, at least as practiced by the United States. And you say now Rumsfeld has officially declared, as a matter of policy, that these contractors are integral to U.S. operations. Do you think that's with malice aforethought, or do you think that we just stumbled into this?
Well, I definitely think that the companies themselves were engaged in a very serious business plan. for a long time. I think that war is profitable, and that in and of itself is a real problem, that monetary gain is a motive for armed combat. And for Rumsfeld, I think that he himself has spent his career working on behalf of the cause of privatization, both he and Dick Cheney. I don't mean to presume, to know what Rumsfeld thinks, but I know from the publicly available statements and writings of Donald Rumsfeld that this was a man who believed in running the Pentagon and its war machine like a business, like a corporation. And I think that this is very much a product of that. There's a necessary, I think, resistance to privatization when you look at government services and essential services. And I think that this administration has opened the door wide, as wide as I think it's ever been in history, to these private companies coming in. And the real danger is they're dealing in human life. They're dealing in war. They're dealing in national security issues. These are life and death issues. And when you put it into the private sector and away from public oversight and transparency, it creates a Frankenstein laboratory type atmosphere, which I think is playing out in a very scary way in Iraq right now.
But who's driving this, the companies or the Defense Department?
I think it's all of them. Well, no, I don't think it's the Defense Department. I think that the administration this administration, I think, has been more anti-military than most administrations in history. They've forced these commanders on the ground into totally unwinnable situations. This is a political war. This isn't an engagement for national security of the United States. This is an offensive, aggressive war. And I think it defeats the core reason why a lot of people join the military. We hear testimony after testimony from soldiers on the ground who don't know why they're over there. And Blackwater knows why it's over there. Blackwater is over there to be at the vanguard of an offensive war, protecting the most senior U.S. officials in Iraq. That, to me, is a problem. And then when you look at the fact that they're bankrolling the politicians that press most passionately for the war, then you see a sort of system that I think raises a lot of serious questions.
Put aside for a moment the whole debate over whether we should have gotten into this war in the first place. Just accept that we are where we are. Could we be fighting this war without Blackwater and the other military contracting firms?
I don't think that the Bush administration would be able to sustain the occupation of Iraq without Blackwater and the other private military firms, and that's the exact reason why I think there's a serious problem with it. I don't think that the American people believe in this war anymore. I don't think that the military believes in this war. And so the Bush administration needs the private sector. They need companies like Blackwater and KBR and Triple Canopy and DynCorp. They need these companies to keep the war going. And that, to me, is one of the most dramatic examples of how dangerous these developments have been. You no longer rely on your citizenry to wage wars. You rely on private companies. And that, in and of itself, I think, is a serious problem.
You rattled off some names there. Describe to me the leaders in this industry.
Well, I mean, Halliburton is probably the most famous war contractor, and a lot of people pick on Halliburton because of Dick Cheney's connection to the company, and they talk about the cronyism. Halliburton was a very successful company when Bill Clinton was president, and Clinton was a major supporter of privatization of the military bureaucracy. And so, Halliburton has emerged as the largest contractor in the war, and its former subsidiary KBR. This is a company, and the two of them together, that have $16 billion plus in contracts for the Iraq War. DynCorp is a company that is a private military company like Blackwater that you probably encountered when you were in Bosnia. DynCorp was heavily involved with the wars in the Balkans. Continues to be a major war contractor on the ground in Iraq. But I sort of look at DynCorp as like the Walmart of private security, whereas Blackwater is sort of like it's kind of like the Prada. I mean, these are high-end guys. DynCorp provides a wide variety of soldiers from various backgrounds. Blackwater provides elite soldiers, and so you have KBR, Halliburton, and Blackwater, I think, become very interesting because they're so politically connected to the Bush administration. But in reality, those two companies are two in a sea of a lot of war contractors that are making a lot of money.
I remember during Abu Ghraib, it turned out that a lot of the people under investigation were not, in fact, MPs, but were contractors who were working as translators for the interrogation teams.
Right, and there are lawsuits now that have stemmed from that, civilian lawsuits. The companies that have been identified as allegedly being involved at Abu Ghraib, Titan, Khaki, Even though you raised that, I still think many Americans are unaware of the fact that it wasn't just Lindy England who was at Abu Ghraib. And that's one of the real problems here. It's the grunts on the ground are being prosecuted or court-martialed for infractions that appear to go very high up the chain of command. And in the case of contractors, they're not being prosecuted either. And so oftentimes it's just these kids who signed up to be in the Pennsylvania National Guard to go and stop floods and find themselves in the middle of some hellhole somewhere. And they're really the ones who are the scapegoats for a much, much bigger scandal.
So we've talked almost exclusively about the role of these firms in Iraq. Where else are they at work for the U.S. government?
Well, one last thing I wanted to say, to go back to your other point, 40 cents of every dollar that's being spent on the occupation of Iraq is going to private military, to war contractors, not just private military contractors. $4 billion has been spent on private security services in Iraq alone. Now, companies like Blackwater increasingly have their sights set on domestic deployments inside of the United States. I was down in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit. I was standing on a corner on Bourbon Street in the French Quarter talking to 2 New York City police officers. I'm from New York. And an unmarked car speeds up next to us, and out of the car pop 4 just bulky guys wearing flak jackets, khaki uniforms, M4 machine guns, another pistol strapped to their legs. And they come up to the cops and they say, where are the rest of the Blackwater guys? And the New York police officers say, oh, there's a lot of them. They're down the street, and they tell them the hotel where they are. And then they get back into the car and they speed off, no license plates on the car. And I said to the police officers, Blackwater, you mean like the guys in Iraq? And he said, oh yeah, they're all over the place here. So I found some of these Blackwater guys on the street and just struck up a conversation with them. And I said, so what are you guys doing down here? What's your mission? And they said, we're here to confront criminals and stop looters. And I said, under whose authority are you down here? And they kind of fumbled with each other. And then one guy pulls a gold law enforcement badge. He says, I was deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana. And I was saying, are you guys on federal contract down here? Are you on a state contract? And they said, well, we can't really talk about it, but we're sleeping in a camp organized by the Department of Homeland Security. So I looked into it a little bit further, and I was able to determine that, in fact, the Department of Homeland Security had hired Blackwater to engage in security operations in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And when I got the contracts, it turns out that Blackwater guys on the ground had told me they were getting paid $350 a day. Blackwater was billing the federal government $950 per day per man for Blackwater operators deployed in the hurricane zone. At one point, David, they had 600 men stretched from Texas through Mississippi and the Gulf. They were pulling in about $240,000 a day for security operations in the hurricane zone at a time when there was a scandal over $2,000 debit cards for people who were internally displaced.
That figure you used, $4 billion on security in Iraq.
Right.
Is that $4 billion spent by the U.S. government?
Yes, that's according to Representative Henry Waxman. That's something that came out of the initial hearing he held on Blackwater on February 7th in the Oversight Committee.
So these are taxpayer dollars.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So how does the taxpayer know that he's getting his money's worth? Put aside whether it's a good or a bad thing, how do you know you're getting your money's worth?
You don't. And that's a major controversy in Congress right now. Representative Jan Schakowsky, who's on the Select Intelligence Committee, since 2004, when I've been talking to her about this issue of contractors, she's been trying to get information. Just tell me how many contractors there are in Iraq. Tell me how many contracts we have in excess of $5 million. Tell me how many have been killed. Tell me how many have been wounded. Tell me how many investigations are open at the Justice Department. No answers to any of these questions. And so for years, you have several congresspeople, some of them in influential positions, who have been unable to get any information about the operations of these companies. That's starting to change. But it took Henry Waxman, since the Fallujah ambush happened of those Blackwater guys, he's been investigating this one contract. He started aggressively doing it in November of 2004. It took him until February 7th, 2007, to just get an answer as to whose contract that ultimately was. And it turns out it was a subcontract with KBR. And so now KBR is being forced to give back to the federal government $20 million for unauthorized use of security services in Iraq. And they inform their shareholders that they may have to return as much as $400 million if the Army continues its investigation.
I think earlier you used a figure of 100,000
right.
security consultants.
No, there's 100,000 private contractors. That includes all the KBR, right. And then of the military contractors, maybe a fifth of that 100,000 are engaged in military-type activities.
So that would include, for instance, CBS hires a security firm in Iraq to protect its staff. They would be included in the 100,000, but not in the 20,000.
Right. Well, I actually don't know how that works because the 100,000 figure comes from the Department of Defense census. But even the Department of Defense has said that it's not quite sure how accurate that is. And a lot of independent analysts say it's bigger. The Government Accountability Office says there are 48,000 employees of private military firms. And of those, some senior people in Congress say that about 20 to 25,000 are engaged in active military operations. When a company like CBS hires private security, it would be unclear, do they come out of that pool or do they come out of the pool of private security contractors that aren't on government contract? For instance, KBR hires Blackwater outside of its government work to protect its office and do force protection. So it's unclear. I mean, but the fact that you ask it is interesting because it's like a Wild West atmosphere over there. The Times of London said that the war boom in Iraq is not oil but security.
How did you get interested in Blackwater?
I first went to Iraq in 1998, and it was the first of many trips that I would take to Iraq. I went in and out of the country from 98 until 2003 when the occupation began. And I actually had spent time in Fallujah. In fact, in the summer of 2002, I camped out in Fallujah, which now would be an unthinkable thing. I used to play dominoes on Al-Rashid Street in Baghdad, which you'd be insane to step foot on Al-Rashid Street as a white American. And I knew many people in Fallujah and knew that city well. It was a beautiful city. They called it the city of mosques, and it was I had something in my heart for the city of Fallujah. And so when this ambush happened of these Blackwater guys, I paid very close attention to it. And when the siege of Fallujah happened, and we saw the suffering play out, I started to say, oh, I mean, the deaths of 4 private military contractors was worth the life of an entire city. And that began the process of looking into them. When I really realized how serious of a story it was, though, was in New Orleans. When you see guys who 2 weeks earlier had just been in Iraq, all of a sudden deploying on the streets of an American city, heavily armed, as though they were in Iraq, I just said, this is unbelievable.